Health and Healthy Environment, NGO from Armenia, and we're the National SAICM focal point, and we're a member of IPEN, and I will be facilitating this meeting on behalf of IPEN. The topic of today's technical briefing is financing the sound management of chemicals and waste beyond 2020, a coordinated tax or fee on the chemical industry. Now I would like to introduce the presenters. Jody Ganji is a science and technical advisor for International Pollutants Elimination Network, IPEN. Joe has helped coordinate IPEN engagement in SAICM since his first preparatory meeting in 2003, and currently serves as the public interest NGO representative to the meetings of the SAICM Bureau. David Azoulay is a senior attorney with the Center for International Environmental Law, CIEL, and director of the Environment Health Program. David has been involved with SAICM and global chemical and waste policy since 2009. In addition, Nathaniel Eisen from CIEL is with us and available to help answer questions after presentations. The integrated approach to financing contains 3 pillars that form the foundation of the current Beyond 2020 negotiations on financing. It's mainstreaming, industry involvement, and dedicated external finance. However, as noted in a recent UNEP evaluation, the approach has not yet been operationalized as it concerns the industry involvement part of the integrated approach to financing. CIEL and IPEN have a tangible proposal to finance chemical safety actions, and there will be an interesting presentation with some time to take questions and hear your feedback. For the question, I would kindly ask you to use the question and answers dialog box. It would be easier for us to see. And also please note that the session will be recorded and will be available to SAICM on SAICM website. Thank you very much. And now I pass the floor on to the presenters. Joe, please.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all for participating in this webinar. This is a presentation about how and why the chemical industry should participate financially in the management of its products. This is a joint project of the Center for International Environmental Law and IPEN, the International Pollutants Elimination Network. And there is a detailed report and a summary document that is present on the technical briefing part of the SAICM website. There are also other links which we will provide at the end of the presentation. So let's get started with a look at how big the chemical industry actually is. This second edition of the Global Chemicals Outlook was released by UNEP last year, and it has some facts that I think would surprise a lot of people. The synergies between chemical safety and climate are often discussed, but most people are not aware of the industry's role in consuming energy and releasing carbon dioxide. The industry is also projected to grow quite rapidly with its expansion into Asia and the Middle East. This is the proportion of sales in 2017, but by 2030, it's projected that China will occupy more than 50% of global sales. Now, the size of the industry is much bigger than most people think. In 2017, the estimate was nearly $6 trillion US. And by 2030, this is expected to grow to almost double to $11 trillion. And you'll notice that this scale here, this $1 trillion, is a little difficult to imagine. None of us have $1 trillion. So let's have a look at how big $1 trillion actually is so we can get a good sense of the size of the industry. So here's a guy standing in front of $1 million in $100 bills, and this would fit into a backpack or a small briefcase. But if we go up to 1 billion US dollars, now this is more serious. 2 rows of pallets, they reach above his waist. And this is big, but the scale of 1 trillion US dollars is a completely different story. Here we have double stacked pallets and a huge array of them. And over on the far left, you can see our guy standing there. Now, the industry does not make one of these. It actually makes almost 6 of these, and that is projected to nearly double by 2030. Now, the reason the industry is so profitable is shown here. The industry effectively privatizes or internalizes its profits, but externalizes or socializes many costs. These costs include serious harms to human health and the environment, and it means that the industry does not pay for the true cost of its products. This is how the industry can maintain its profit margins of 12 to 16%. Now, you might be wondering about internalization and polluter pays principle and whether this is some new idea, but these are photos from the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. And as everyone on this webinar knows, one of the key outputs was the Rio Principles. And this principle, Rio Principle 16, clearly states that environmental costs should be internalized and that the polluter should bear the cost of pollution. And this is analogous to something we all learned as children, which is that we should clean up our own mess. Now, the polluter pays principle and internalization of costs has also been part of the SAICM process and related initiatives. The original SAICM agreement from 2006 specifically mentions internalization of costs, and the final integrated approach adopted by UNEA also specifically mentions this expectation of the industry. The impact evaluation of the Quick Start program suggests that the industry should provide stronger participation in a financial sense. And if we go forward to 2019, the independent evaluation of SAICM indicates that governments view internalization of costs as actually shifting the costs of production and management of chemicals from the public sector to the private sector where they belong. And this is why delegates at the third open-ended working group meeting requested the Secretariat to produce a document that described mechanisms for doing this. And this document is available in draft form and will be discussed at the fourth intersessional process meeting. Now, at the root of the industry's externalized costs are these serious facts, which come from UNEP. And after decades of chemicals production and attention to management of chemicals, large amounts of chemicals and other pollutants are still being released to the environment in large quantities. And the consequence of that is their widespread presence in the environment, and we can find them even in our own bodies. Now, it's difficult to put a specific dollar figure on the industry's externalized costs, but here are 3 examples. The first one, endocrine disrupting chemicals and the health impacts they cause. Second, volatile organic compounds and their pollution. And the third one deals with childhood lead poisoning due to exposure to lead paint, lead acid battery recycling, and other sources. And the estimates about how much these things cost each year are shown on the right, and you can see that these are enormous. There are only 3 examples here, but just these 3 examples illustrate very substantial annual costs, and these are all costs that the chemical industry does not pay. Now, the externalized costs also include pesticide poisoning. UNEP made this estimate in the cost of inaction report, and it compared these costs with the overseas development assistance to health. And you can see that the costs due to harms from pesticide poisoning is significantly greater than the entire overseas development assistance to health, excluding HIV/AIDS. One other externalized cost is actually death. And this astounding statistic comes from the former Special Rapporteur, UN Special Rapporteur for Toxics, Baskut Tunjak, who presented this information along with other information about occupational health and safety in a report to the UN General Assembly in 2018. Now, we've seen a serious array of externalized costs from the chemical industry. And so I think most people outside of our world would think that this must mean that the governments must be very well financed in order to manage this large threat to human health and the environment. So let's have a look at the financing of international chemicals agreements. So here are 5 agreements that we are all familiar with, sort of principal chemicals agreements. And it's reasonable to ask which of these have a financial mechanism. And most people would answer, well, they should all have one, because how else are developing and transition countries going to implement their obligations under this agreement? And in fact, only the Stockholm Convention and the Minamata Convention have financial mechanisms. So let's look at 2 examples from this list of 5. I picked Stockholm Convention and SAICM, of course. And the Stockholm Convention has made some needs estimates. It's done a few of these. And the one from COP8 made a comparison of the needs assessment. And I compared this to the estimated GEF7 allocation for the Stockholm Convention. And you can see that the needs that are estimated to fulfill the obligations under the treaty are more than 10 times greater than the actual financial allocation for it. In addition, for a number of reasons, this needs assessment is quite conservative and does not actually estimate the full cost. If we look at SAICM, it's also quite serious. The GEF funding for SAICM is that little white sliver there, which is 0.2% of the budget. And ironically, the coverage of SAICM is huge, and that's the red part. So what we have here is the agreement with the broadest scope has actually the smallest amount of money. Now, in 2019, this independent evaluation of SAICM became available for a period of 10 years. And this document shows also some serious things. The first thing is it draws a direct line between the inability of SAICM to achieve its objectives and insufficient financing. And this insufficiency was not just limited to countries and their needs to implement this agreement, but it also included the Secretariat. For more than half of this time period, the Secretariat had a huge budget shortfall. And the most serious consequence of that is shown right here. The original enthusiasm for SAICM was that it would address the gap in chemicals management capacity between developed countries and developing and transition countries. And so when we get to the 2020 mark, if the gap is the same, then we have not achieved the objective. But in this case, what was realized was that the gap was actually bigger than it started out to be. And this is really very much connected to the insufficiency of financing. Now, so far, what you have been hearing are some reasons for why the chemical industry should contribute financially to the management of its products. But I'm guessing that many of you are curious about how this can be done. And to comment on that, I would like to invite David Azoulay of CL to continue this presentation and explain a little bit about our proposal. David, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Joe, and welcome everyone. So onto the question why, of course, we're not starting from scratch, and we're not the first one to think or reflect on how to adequately fund the chemical and waste cluster. The integrated approach to financing identifies three main pillars: dedicated external financing, industry involvement, mainstreaming, and development planning. And on this slide, the three pillars are showed as providing equivalent or having equivalent importance or providing equivalent sort of resources. Now, in reality, the middle pillar is actually much smaller than what we're seeing now, and should be much bigger, in part because the industry, as was just mentioned by Joe, is the stakeholder and the group actually profiting from the current situation. So we've started from this situation, and we're really focused on trying to find a solution that was both easily implementable, or as easily implementable as possible, as well as comprehensive as possible. And as you can imagine, those two elements are not always compatible. So what we did was looked at the chemical supply chain and production chain, and identified a small number of chemicals called basic chemicals. We have identified about 35 of those that serve as the feedstock for the production of almost every others of the tens of thousands of chemicals that are currently on the market. And the idea would be to implement a 0.5% tax or fee on the production value of those 35 basic chemicals, or on this short list of basic chemicals. And how that works. So the fee would be collected from the manufacturer on the value of those 35 chemicals, and the funds would then be abundant, the resource collected, into a global fund for chemical safety. In the thought starter that we provided, we did not get into the detail of which fund should that be, or in the terms of reference of what that fund, how that fund should function, because obviously we wanted to leave that up, and we believe that this should be part of the discussion that happens among stakeholders, the SAICM stakeholders. So the resources collected would go into this global fund for chemical safety, and would then be distributed to the countries and stakeholders who are implementing and putting in place risk reduction and risk management activities and initiatives. And as you can see on the slide, the fact that you are participating in the collection of the resources that go into the fund does not mean that you would not have access to the fund. There is no separation between those who abond to the fund and those who can benefit from its resources to implement risk management or risk reduction activities on the ground. Now, you may be wondering, really, can a 0.5% fee or tax raise sufficient money to address the challenges that we're facing in the chemical and waste cluster? Well, based on what Joe mentioned earlier and the actual value of, or the actual profits of the industry, if we apply this tax to a 2.3 trillion annual sales of basic chemicals, we end up with a number that is orders of magnitude greater to what we successfully raise these days. And that presents a very large amount, 11.5 billion, that would be available every year, that could match the needs for implementation of all the activities that are identified under SAICM, BRS, and MINAMAT. One other added advantage of focusing on a small number of chemicals, the basic chemicals, is that the vast majority of basic chemicals are actually produced in a very small number of countries. The data we had access to was a little outdated, so it's likely that the numbers are a little different by now. But while there are probably about 80 countries that host basic chemical manufacturing facilities, almost 80% of those is located in a very small number of countries, from 10 to 12, depending on the figures that you look at. And so as a result, you would only need a very small number of countries to implement this tax or fee to raise extremely significant amounts of resources to cover the needs of chemicals management, chemicals and waste management, and risk reduction. Now, there's been a lot of discussion in past SAICM meetings and elsewhere, and generally speaking in the chemical and waste cluster, to discuss whether the use of economic instrument should be put in place at the national or global levels. This slide will try to go very quickly over why we believe the global level is actually much more appropriate than the national level. First of all, as was partly mentioned before, using national economic mechanisms do not provide sufficient revenue. And this was also highlighted by the report that was commissioned by the open-ended working group to the Secretariat. And one example could help just picture this. In the EU, the European Union, which is probably the jurisdiction with the most advanced chemical management infrastructure, as well as most advanced economic instruments, to cover the cost of the chemical management, where the European Chemical Agency is funded through levies or tax for chemicals that are being put on the market. Even in this situation, the costs of functioning of the European Chemical Agency cannot be covered by the funds that are being collected through the national and even regional economic instrument, despite the fact that this is an area where the chemical industry is actually very present. And so addressing this at the global level would allow to address the globality of the production of those chemicals and raise significant revenues that could match the needs. Second of all, we've been doing a lot of work over the past few years around trying to help countries implement the kind of economic instruments that we're talking about. And very often what we've seen is that it was difficult for government to put in place these kinds of instruments because of something that most of you will probably be familiar with, which is a sort of employment blackmail about, oh, but if you raise the cost for us to operate in your country, we will then go and operate in another country. Whether this manifests or not after the implementation of such economic instrument is yet to be seen, and there are actually not necessarily demonstrated effects of this. But very often, the employment and development blackmail is enough to do this. So as opposed to creative, a competitive environment between countries who are suffering the similar kinds of impact, approaching this question from a global level allows to create a level playing field, not only for resource mobilization, but also for actual implementation of risk management and risk reduction measures. Now, finally, approaching this question at the national level is wholly insufficient to adequately implement the polluter pays principle for a number of reasons. As was mentioned earlier also by Joe, many countries do not necessarily have chemical manufacturing facilities in their country, and yet suffer extreme impacts both on health or the health of their population or on their environment. Also, because the global supply chain of chemicals is, as its name indicates, global, it is extremely difficult not to create dissonance or discrepancies between the different countries and allow certain industry to escape their responsibility by trying to look for the place to manufacture their chemicals where the least burdensome legal framework is put in place. As opposed to this, if you approach this at the global level, it allows you to implement the polluter pays principle in a more fair and just way, and in a way that, as we've mentioned before, allows for a better level playing field and for raising significant amounts of revenues. So if we now try to summarize very briefly the presentation and the ideas that are laid out in the thought starter, first of all, the industry is extremely profitable. And it is profitable mostly by taking advantage of externalized costs and internalized profit. We do have a global model that should allow us to address this particular issue, the integrated approach to financing. However, it has been demonstrated that this integrated approach is not well implemented and does not fulfill its promises, in particular in relation to industry involvement. We have also seen in this presentation that the whole chemical and waste cluster is very largely underfunded. And those of you who have been part of those discussions, whether it was under BRS, Minamata, SAICM, or other instrument along the past decade or so, know how much this represents the major obstacle to implement ambition and to implement actual protections of individuals' rights and to better support countries' development, safe and healthy development. So the idea is to implement a global approach, coordinated global approach to mobilizing resources to that effect. And as we've seen, this would allow to provide sufficient funding to cover the implementation measures and enforcement measures that are required by the international instruments that we have put in, that currently exists and we're participating in developing. Thanks very much. I'm done with this. On the final slide, which you briefly saw, but that you're about to see again, here are links for you to have access to the full thought starter, including an annex that looked at other types of existing globally coordinated economic instrument, from the Tobin tax to other, which led us to developing this particular proposal, as well as a short video that will go through most of the presentation that you've seen today, as well as a question and answer document, that a frequently asked question document that we've prepared on the basis of the question that were most commonly raised in our consultation and preparation of this particular document. Thank you very much for your attention, and I now very much look forward to your, I am sure, what will be fascinating questions, or at least very interesting questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David and Joe, for this presentation and for sharing proposed mechanism for industry involvement, which is, as stated, simply is for coordinated fee on production value of basic chemicals. Now I would encourage the participants to ask questions, and please use the dialog box, questions and answers. We may wait a couple of minutes until the questions come, or if we have someone who has requested the floor, I just do not see these people. So questions, please. Thank you.
So we have Zuki, who has asked for the floor. Alex, could you unmute?
Thank you so much, Nalini. And thank you, Goha, for facilitating, and thanks to IPEN and CL. Thank you for affording me the opportunity to take the floor. I'm very grateful. I'm speaking on behalf of the African region for this opportunity, in the sense that it brings to the fore essential or critical decisions that have been put in the back burner in all throughout our discussion and negotiations thus far. In SAICM, for example, the Principle 16 of the Rio Declaration, for example, the integrated approach, which we all signed and agreed to in New York, the implementation thereof has been zilch, nothing. And when we talk about it, it's like we're talking about something that people do not know, yet we were collectively part and parcel of that agreement, and implementation has failed. And also critical in this case is bringing to the fore the independent SAICM reviewers report, which showed explicitly that the Secretariat was not funded adequately. I mean, if the Secretariat itself is not funded, how on earth are we expecting the Secretariat to deliver on its mandate? Because you need warm bodies to do or to undertake the work that we have indicated as the needs, particularly us as developing countries. So it is important that we bring those things to the fore. It's realities. They may not sound sweet, but it's realities for us not to repeat the same mistakes that we did before that led to us not being successful as SAICM. Within the African region, we're doing very well with the pilot projects that most of them became institutionalized. So what I would say as not just South Africa, as an African region, we're fully behind this proposal. And one thing I need to indicate on behalf of the African region is that we wish to express and to convey the message that nothing is possible without the resources that are predictable, resources that are adequate or sufficient to ensure that the needs, I mean, we have several reports from UNEP indicating that, for example, the emerging issues have not been addressed fully. Some are because the old ones, or should I say, they are in the developed countries, so there's no more push, and it's only the developing countries that are still facing problems with those. So for us within the African region, as long as there are no resources, there's no commitment to this proposal and resources to ensure that, because we can't be talking and pushing for saying these are the challenges, yet that which is practically the resources that are essential or critical for the implementation are not there, or there's no commitment to that. So for us, everything that is negotiated is as important, but nothing is as important as the resources, which is the finance aspect. And also what I would like to say about the proposal is a global level versus national level. National level will not work. We have seen the weaknesses within whereby companies are bullying countries, as in not committing, and double standards. Companies in developed countries behaving in a certain way whereby they are responsible and accountable in terms of their actions, whereas in developing countries, they are not. And when then that is raised by the technical scientists at a lower level, they go to the politicians and crowdfile and say, jobs, jobs, jobs. So we're very grateful to IPEN and CL and to the Secretariat for this platform. And for us, we're fully behind this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noluzuko, for these very important questions that you have just raised about predictable funding, adequate funding, sufficient, and also the role of the Secretariat and the lessons learned with other funding instruments. And I'll now invite our panelists and Nathaniel to give answers. Mm-hmm. Who will take the question? Hello?
Okay, I will give it a try. I think it was more of a comment than a question, and thank you very much, Zuki, for pointing out a few important elements. First, that this is not a new topic for us, those of us that have participated in these discussions, and the importance really of a global mechanism. This is touched upon somewhat in the Secretariat paper on this topic, and our intention or our goal was just to try to think of some way to operationalize the integrated approach pillar of industry involvement. The phrase itself is kind of vague, so we wanted to propose something that would be more tangible. And what we discovered is that if we could have the cooperation of a relatively small number of countries, many countries would benefit, and the amount of money would be substantially more than governments themselves would or even should be able to provide. So interested in other comments, and thank you again for participating.
Thank you, John. Thank you for comment. We have got a couple of questions here in Q&A. And one is asked, there is Zuleika who would like to know what is the route to have success in the proposed approach. Thank you.
Okay, I can try to start on this one. Joe and Nathaniel, please feel free to fill in. I think the route is first to acknowledge that the current situation is not viable, where impacts on health and the environment from the mismanagement of chemicals is in the billions of dollars annually, very largely supported by countries in transition and developing countries, that this situation cannot continue on, that it is not an acceptable situation. Once we may have agreed on this, then comes the question of how do we actually put this in place? And here I believe that the SAICM Beyond 2020 process, the way it is structured now, gives us a very good opportunity to develop and to adopt the decision that would lead to the putting in place of this particular solution. This may not be the only forum in which this could or should be discussed. The BRS COPs are also usually have a heavy conversation around finances. The Minamata Convention has some, and we know that UNEA also has control over some aspect of the global financing of the chemical and waste cluster. It was the UNEA who originally came up with the integrated approach and who has authority over the special fund, for example. So there are different ways, but I think the first element of a successful strategy is to ensure that all options are on the table. And as Zuki mentioned in her previous intervention, with the recognition that nothing can be agreed to further unless we put in place an adequate financing mechanism that can provide sufficient, adequate, sustainable, and and sustainable financing to implement those obligations.
Thank you, David. Now, if you allow, we'll move to the next question from Alejandra. Are there any other global taxes already? Sorry. any other global taxes already in force that we could study to better understand how this can be implemented?
Nathaniel, I think you're very well placed to answer this question because you have studied all the other existing instruments.
Okay,
Yeah,
Nathaniel?
thanks, and thank you for this question. We summarized some of the previous international or coordinated approaches to cost recovery in the first annex to the report. And so one very prominent example is the International Oil Pollution Compensation Funds, whose members have agreed to a system of levying fees on recipients of marine shipments of crude oil, and then direct those fees to a global fund. A number of countries have also agreed to place a tax on aviation, and devoted the resources to purchases of medicine for developing countries. It should also be noted in this regard that a tax on chemical feedstocks has actually been implemented in at least one jurisdiction, namely the United States, and raised very significant quantities of revenue annually. So the current proposal is a hybrid of existing successful examples of international and domestic taxes and fees. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathaniel. I don't see any question in the question and answers. Maybe Nalini can help me if there is someone who is requesting the floor at this moment.
So far, no questions. Perhaps there was a question early this in the morning session, Joe, where you showed the list of the chemicals. I don't know if you'd like to show that.
Sure, I would be happy to show that. Let me just get it set up here. Okay.
Once people think of the question.
Yeah, some of you might be wondering when we speak about basic chemicals, feedstock chemicals is another word for them. So I can just show you the list from the report. Okay, so I think you can see that. This is basically from the report. It's about 35 of them. And these are fundamental feedstock chemicals that are used to make many other substances. And our idea was, as mentioned, a fee or a tax on the production value of manufacturing these substances. You can read the details in the detailed report, or if you want something a little bit more digestible, there is a very short summary of this report. And just while I'm here with the screen share, these are the 10 countries that we mentioned. It would be interesting if UNIDO had any other information or any updates to this data. In addition, we would be interested if the countries themselves might have some information that would be useful with regards to this question. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. I don't see any other questions here. And if we do not have, yes, Nalini?
Yes, there's just one more question from Abbas Tarabi in the Q&A. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want me to read it?
Yes, I
Okay.
would appreciate. Thank you.
So from Mr. Abbas Tarabi, so most countries referred to in David's presentation are from developed countries. In the context of consensus-based MEAs of the PRS, Minamata, and SAICM, how is it possible to satisfy those countries to accept this great idea?
So maybe I can start to address this by mentioning something that I have mentioned in my presentation already, which is noting that even for those countries are currently struggling to fund their chemical and waste management infrastructure. I mentioned the situation in the EU, where the EU has set up a quite comprehensive, far from perfect, of course, if you ask me, but already quite as advanced, at least most advanced in the world system to manage chemicals. And even there, at the regional level, it is impossible for the EU to fully fund their waste and management capacities. So my sense is that one of the key message to support that is also insist on the fact that the situation is not unique to developing and countries in transition. The impact is also very largely felt in developed countries. Joe mentioned earlier costs in relation to the cost of certain endocrine disrupting chemicals, for example, or certain COVs. And some of those calculations were not made at the global level, but were made at the EU or US level. And this already identifies very severe costs that are currently being suffered by those countries. So already making this apparent and making apparent the whole process by which industry is currently externalizing the cost while internalizing the profit is, I believe, at least a first step toward making this making this go forward. But maybe Joe or others, you would have elements to add to this question.
Thanks, David. I can try to add one more thing here. I think the question is sort of asking, how can we convince them to, make the tax and send it to the fund? The first step is sort of getting reactions to the proposal. The report is written as a thought starter, and so it would be useful for those countries and others where there is basic chemical production to read the report and think about it. And then one sort of argument in their favor for doing something like this is that currently the model that has been used for many years is for developed countries to take taxpayer money, give it as a one-stop donation to the Global Environment Facility, and then that money is redistributed in some sort of financial mechanism or in projects. And really, I think many economists would describe that as sort of questionable economics, because really, instead of taking taxpayer money to fund, chemicals management challenges in developing and transition countries, it would benefit the donor governments to actually be using industry money to do that, because really they're the ones that have the responsibility for doing this. So instead of them collecting from their taxpayers, they would collect a vanishingly small proportion or fee from their industry. And that would be, in fact, much larger amount of money than even the governments could provide. And this has been sort of the frustration for many years, is that ministries of environment, they're not the strongest ministry in any government, and they are not really the ones that can adequately convince their treasuries for enormous sums of money to go to this purpose. So those are some ideas, but ultimately it will depend on sort of awareness of the proposal, understanding it, and maybe some conversation about how it could be implemented and what some of the obstacles to it might be. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Joe, for taking this question. I do not see any other questions here. Do we have requests from the phone? No. 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 Okay. I will ask now, before we adjourn it, maybe we'll ask our panelists, David or Joe, just to summarize a couple of final remarks. Yeah.
I think before we do it, just so someone raise their hand in the chat.
Hand?
Oh, we have two more hands that were just raised in the chat now.
Okay. Now then we will request to give the floor to switch on the mics.
Okay, so
I just don't see
Alejandra,
these people. Yeah.
and I think
Yes, please.
Zuki had her hand up from before, so it's Alejandra asking for the floor, and she's been unmuted.
Hi. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, carry on.
Okay, great. So hello to everybody. Nice to see some of you again. I was hearing the presentation and introductions, and I have several thoughts. That's something I wanted to share with you with maybe this idea on where would the money go? I mean, Joe, you just presented this model, like the actual model is actually the money going to deaf, and from deaf going to the several projects. Is the proposal thinking that in terms of implementing? And also, you just said something about these obstacles that you foresee. So if you can share with us some of those ideas that you have already identified, what would be the obstacles of putting this in place? Thank you.
Alejandra, maybe can you repeat your last part of your question, because you kind of you broke up a bit. So
yeah,
if you could just
sorry,
summarize your question, that would be great.
I have bad signal, but on one side, to understand if the proposal has thought about the money, if the money would go to deaf and from deaf to developing countries, and on the other side, which are the obstacles you have identified so far for implementing this global tax?
Okay, I'll take a first start at it, and perhaps others would like to weigh in. The example I was giving with the Jeff was actually not connected to our proposal. I was just explaining sort of the traditional route of donor financing and making a contrast between collecting money from taxpayers and giving it to the Jeff, and then the Jeff redistributes, to our proposal, which is collecting money from the industry and funneling that money to a global fund. You will notice that we did not spend time in this presentation or in the report getting into the details of the global fund. There are some ideas that we could think of for that, but we did not get into that. So hopefully that's clear. On the issue of the possible obstacles, those countries should speak for themselves about their own obstacles. But one possible obstacle is that maybe a Ministry of Environment or possibly a Ministry of Health might be making this argument, and politically that might be maybe not the strongest ministry to make the argument, but it will depend upon many factors, and those will be sort of individual to specific countries. So I guess I would like to leave the list of obstacles to be presented maybe by the countries themselves, and then we can think about how to solve them. Thank you.
And maybe if you allow me to build a little on the question, the first part of the question on the fund, and we do not want to get into the detail of what fund would be used or where it would be, how exactly it would be managed, because we believe that this is a conversation to be had in the context of the Beyond 2020 conversation that is going on. But one thing that we could say is there are currently two main funds that are used for the financing of the chemical and waste cluster, the JEF funding and the special program. Both have a number of shortcomings, whether it is the amount of co-financing that is required to access it, the very heavy and burdensome process to access to the fund, or the limitation on who can access the fund and the activities that can be funded for the special program, for example. What we do want to mention in that respect is that it is extremely important to learn from the to learn from the experiences that were developed in SAICM itself, such as the Quick Start program that was for a long time held as one of the most successful and efficient financial mechanisms by countries and stakeholders alike to have access to it. So whatever form and whatever form this particular funds take, I think it would be really important to build upon the successes and what was identified as obstacles in the existing mechanisms that we know of.
Thank you, David and Joe.
So Zuki would like to take the floor.
Zuki, yes, please, Zuki.
Thanks. I think with David's intervention, because he's touched mostly, thank you for affording me the floor again. He's touched on the issues I wanted to raise, because I was going to highlight the fact that we need to be honest with the challenges we're faced with. One thing I just want to add, I think Joe touched on it when he was presenting. We've seen the effectiveness evaluation of the Stockholm goes with resources. And the special program, the limitations, it's a challenge. And in terms of resources, are just not even coming close to being enough. We have not seen, from the industry perspective, implementation of the Rio Declaration principles. We have not seen the implementation voluntarily by industry of the integrated approach. And with those years having passed by, not seeing anything coming to fruition, there has to be something that we have to come up with to really, because we can't have decisions that are not there, that are not implemented, that we took collectively. And we're continually using these chemicals, and you see that the countries that are most affected, or regions, are the developing countries. And worse, with chemicals that are banned in developed countries that continually get to be exported to developing countries. So there's a lot around this. And as developing countries, we can't. And because there are cases whereby we have experienced, for example, in the African region, in our regional preparatory meetings for COPs, whereby industry is misleading our people and saying, if you agree to the listing of this chemical, it will be too expensive or it won't be available. So it's really a lot that you are faced with as developing countries. And the basis is we need to deal with the problem at the source. And industry, as the ones that are benefiting from the sale of these chemicals, they need to come to the party and own up and be accountable. Thank you.
Thank you, Zuki. Now who will react? Please.
So Savet would like to take the floor, and then there's a question by Silla after that.
Hi, good afternoon. Savet Gurin speaking from ICCA. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, David, for your interesting presentation. I would like to comment and also raise a question, if I may. So firstly, on the comment, I think it's actually unfortunate or pity that the presentation is a bit narrow-minded and only focusing on one aspect. And I think there we can all agree, including industry, that indeed more finances would be useful. But you are foregoing that there is already a vast majority of finances, and not only finances and efforts already going into SAICM, which can improve from being more efficient and effective. And that's the part I'm missing a bit in your presentation. It's always talking about increasing the pot of money, but the source of the problem, as Zuki just explained, is not only the lack of more money, but it's also the lack of the capacity in developing countries to deal with the chemicals management, to safely manage chemicals. And I think many speakers, for example, last week at the OECD Global Forum on Environment, recognized the need to have capacity building as the clear pillar to look at and to improve these Again, financing is a crucial element. I think we can all agree on that, but I think you are forgoing the most critical aspect in improving the safe chemicals management globally is to look at the capacity building and to ensure that there is in each country an adequate, basic, if you may, a chemicals regulatory framework, including a fee-based system that allows also for internalizing the costs. If we are lacking these basic chemical regulatory frameworks globally and only pushing for an increasing pot of money, I think you will still be in the same position and lack the capacity to help these countries in implementing their chemicals regulatory frameworks. So it's a bit unfortunate that it's a bit narrow-minded presentation in that respect and miss the funds that are already being provided by many stakeholders to help enhance the safe chemicals management. Thank you.
So thanks very much for this remark. I think the point on capacity building is indeed quite important and is identified as one of the many, many activities that are necessary around the world to attain a sound management of chemicals and waste. Now, the challenge is to implement those activities, whether they are capacity building, awareness raising, or very much putting in place an institutional infrastructure in the country. This requires money. And what we've seen in all the projects that we've developed trying to support countries reform their legal framework or support them putting in place the sort of chemicals and waste management infrastructure that would be needed to give them a chance to exert some level of control over what and how chemicals are being sold and used in their country, there is a need for resources. And this is actually identified in the original Global Plan of Action from SAICM, which is a very long laundry list of activities. Very few of these activities, and I mean, those were identified and agreed upon by all stakeholders in 2006. So we all know what needs to be done. The main reason identified by the SAICM review for why most of those activities have not been implemented or put in place was a lack of resources. So this proposal or this thought starter aims to address this question to indeed allow countries and all stakeholders to be in place to implement the activities, awareness raising, capacity building, better control, better custom management, etc., that we all agree on.
Okay, thank you, David. We've got one question here in the Q&A from Sila. You talked about this before, but I was hoping you could elaborate on the next steps. After today, what do you plan to do in order to have this proposal implemented and accepted by governments? Have you already reached out to governments? Thank you. So who is taking this question on next steps?
Okay, I'll try and give that a try. Thank you for this question, for this difficult question. Yes, we have reached out to some governments, not all of them. And I think our first priority was to introduce this thought starter into the group, which is going to take up this topic of financing the virtual working group on this topic within the Beyond 2020 process. So that group is operating now. There is an upcoming deadline for a submission this Friday, and there will be others and other online meetings of this group. And so the first idea or thought was to introduce the idea to this group of delegates, which is struggling and working with the challenges of trying to come up with text for a new agreement. And of course, we're also interested in talking to specific governments about their thoughts about how this could be implemented. Should it be refined somehow? Is there something we did not think of? So we will pursue those discussions as well. And we would encourage governments that are participating in the virtual working group on this process to perhaps investigate the situation in their own government and come with information that may be relevant. I hope I've answered your question at least somewhat. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe, yes, David, you want to add? No?
Just want to add something very briefly, also to mention that as we consulted with a number of governments in the lead up to publishing this proposal, both countries that are considered donor countries and receiving countries, I think one of the things we heard from a number of those participation was some great interest in the topic, but the need for the conversation to happen and to develop in the context of the SAICM Beyond 2020 process, also in order for them to be able to have a more, how can I say? No, I'm not typing.
Alex, maybe if you can just unmute the our participants so that we hear a lot of typing in the background.
Yeah, thanks. So what I was mentioning is what we heard from a lot of the countries was a keen interest and some interest in seeing how the conversation develops, because most of the countries, most of the departments that participate in the meetings here are Ministry of Environment, as Joe mentioned. And we know that putting in place such kind of instrument requires consultation within the government. And so the idea is to let the discussion happen and bear fruit in the context of the chemical and waste cluster to be allowed to then advance it to the next step.
Okay, thank you, David. Any other reactions? And I'm looking at the questions. I seem not to be having more at this moment. Do we have requests for the floor?
No more requests for the floor.
Yes, it has been a very interesting exchange, very active participation. Thank you very much. Let us wait maybe one more second. If we don't see any other attendees requesting for the floor, I think we can summarize the meeting. Yeah. I don't see any questions. But it has been very interesting discussion indeed. We have raised quite a number of concerns and interesting points were raised about need to look at what has been achieved already, to look at the lessons learned, because indeed during these years of implementation of different treaties, some achievements have been noted, and this can be also looked into when we are thinking of a new mechanism to involve the industry. This conversation is a good thought starter. I think it has also allowed the authors of this thought starter, IPEN and CIEL, think a bit more and maybe elaborate further, because indeed we received very interesting feedback. Would you like to comment? No? Okay.
Maybe just thank everyone for their participation and great question, and mention that I'm very much looking forward to continuing this discussion in the context of the virtual working group, as well as in the hopefully to one day come future face-to-face meeting where we'll be able to actually make advances on the text.
Okay, thank you very much. Now let me also thank all the participants for this very interesting and active and open discussion. And I would like to thank SAICM Secretariat for hosting this event. And let us hope that we will achieve some tangible results as to financing, more predictable and sufficient financing for the challenges that we have. Thank you very much, everyone. Take good care. See you. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Goha.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Joe. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.